Conrad Black of Cross Harbour is the author of The Political and Strategic History of the World, Volume 2, From the Caesars to the Peace of Westphalia and Louis XIV. It's AD 14 to 1661. Conrad, many congratulations on The Political and Strategic History of the World, Volume 2, which takes us from the Caesars, from the death of Augustus in AD 14, all the way up to the Peace of Westphalia and Louis XIV, 1,600 plus years later, and you've done it somehow in 1,200 pages. What an achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you. I try and make it as condensed as I can, but balance manageable. Well, you know all about this, Andrew, more than I do. You balance manageable length against reasonable readability. Just hope it comes out right.
Well, it has. In this case, in your volume, it certainly has. Plus, great jokes. By the way, my favourite joke was when you were talking about Elizabeth I sending off somebody called Peregrine Bertie. And you say, Peregrine Bertie, a justly improbable name for someone sent in any mission of conquest on the continent of Europe. but there's...
The one I liked was when some British internecine dispute, somebody was... his passage from London to another centre, Oxford or something, his security was entrusted to so-and-so, who defined his security as delivering his head and body separately to the destination.
Yeah, there's a very good one. All right, look, let's go through it, not necessarily chronologically, but just as thoughts come to me. Was there such a thing as the Dark Ages? Or is that a misnomer by
really? In the sense that I, as a young person, sort of conceived of it as just a period of a couple of centuries where everything was bad, I would say no. But there were certainly dark periods. And of course, that particularly had to do with disasters like plagues and terrible fires and things like that, famines. I mean, they as you know, Andrew, they didn't know how to manage the food supply properly, and there were these terrible wars that went on. And what shocked me most was the casualties in some of these wars. I mean, the 30 Years' War was a terrible war. Now, I always admired Richelieu, and it worked well for him. He bribed the Swedes to do the dirty work, but I always admired the fact that when he died, the Pope said. I mean, as you know, popes are generally assumed to be fairly unconditional in their views about the existence of the divine intelligence. And he said, if there is God, the cardinal will have a great deal to answer for. If not, he was a very great man.
Well, he is a great man from this book, isn't he? And specifically what you like about him, and what I've worked out reading this book that you like about a lot of people, is his two things. The fact that he's cunning and perceptive. Again and again, your heroes and heroines in this book are people who are cunning and perceptive. Do you know that about yourself? Have you worked that out about yourself?
Style and high intellect. I mean, Richelieu did. He took his position as a founder of the French Academy very seriously. That's always the decoration he had around his neck, not a religious one, and or a secular one, governmental. And he was the provost of the Sorbonne throughout his time as chief minister. And he took that very seriously too. He was an authentic scholar, and he had great style. You know, that he made popular the scarlet outfit and so on. And, he had great panache. I've always felt the caricature of him by Dumas and the Three Musketeers was an outrage. I mean, he was a scoundrel in some ways, but he was a very distinguished man also.
Let's stick on the cunning aspect, because you also say, or in fact you don't say, but you quote Henry III of France saying that Elizabeth I of England was the most cunning woman in the world. and you admire her caution on occasion, and her ability to say one thing to the Spanish and something completely different to her own people, especially her own privateers. There's a cunningness there as well that's part of her greatness, isn't there?
You and I, Andrew, have all the time I've known you, have shared amongst many other views our admiration for her. It's surely one of the great ironies of British history that Henry VIII, one of his confected grievances against Anne Boleyn was that she didn't produce a male heir, but the heir she did produce was the greatest monarch in British history, and arguably in European history.
Yes, no, absolutely. I certainly think that. Although you you say there's considerable skepticism about her being the Virgin Queen. This is a pretty outrageous slur, isn't it, for you to throw against the Virgin Queen?
You were riding in cavalier fashion.
I am. I'm the Sir Walter Raleigh of the 21st century as regards this.
With a happier fate, I hope. But
Who's to say?
All right, I'll defer to you in this. I mean, were all those liaisons she had that they never really, as we used to say, university went the distance?
They didn't go the distance. These guys all were hoping that they would, and they were. She loved playing. She loved all the incredibly handsome people, but the idea of Elizabeth the first actually sleeping with Dudley and Leicester and these various people.
Part of her mystique that she was, and of course the state of Virginia was. Paid homage to that alleged condition. No, but look, you know British history better than I do. But is it pretty much agreed by Elizabethan scholars that she was a virgin?
Yes, Anne Somerset, for example,
was there ever any medical attestation to that when she died or anything?
No, I know they certainly didn't check the corpse, the hymen of Elizabeth Gloriana. Absolutely,
a little respect here.
Thank you. So let's talk about her great enemy, Philip of Spain, because there you call him energetic and resourceful, but not ultimately successful, of course.
Yeah, well, look, he gave it a good shot, and he was, of course, the king consort of England for a time. But in the end, Spain didn't have as fine a hand of cards as the British or the French. It being on the other side of the Pyrenees, it was next to Britain the most difficult country to get into, but. So much depended on the Americas, and they mismanaged the Americas. But they were, as you know, the sea lanes were terribly vulnerable to the British and the French and the Dutch, and they went through this charade of pretending they were at peace while encouraging the privateers like Raleigh to terrorize the Spanish galleons and take everything they could. And there was a sort of lifeline there that was it was a kind of a battle of the Atlantic problem, except that they didn't have the naval supremacy that in the Atlantic the British did.
And killing 70,000 people in the Inquisition, that sheer number surprised me. It's a hell of a loss, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the Inquisition tends to be exaggerated by historically minded Jews and Protestants who over-egg it as a pudding a bit. But yeah, look.
Well, it's
Catholic
your number.
Church,
70,000 is your number. It's not the Jews and
the Catholic
Protestant
Church
number.
got quite determined at times to maintain its position. So it did do some rather nasty things, but that wasn't unique to them,
The other statistic about him that struck me as quite extraordinary was the Spanish Armada firing 100,000 cannonballs and not sinking a single English ship during the Spanish Armada. What was going on there? What were they doing? I mean, what a waste, apart from anything else.
And the commander didn't want anything to do with it. He thought the whole mission was insane. Well, he may have been right, but even if he was right, you want a commander who believes in what he's doing, even if he believes in it mistakenly. But really, the Spanish didn't lose that many ships to British gunfire. The whole thing broke up. It was a fiasco, but not it wasn't like the Battle of Cape Matapan where the British sank all the opposition ships.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was the weather, but you're quite right. If you're going to send out a commander to do something, classic examples also being George III sending out those various English Whigs to the War of Independence, who didn't really want to win terribly much, or Massena being sent off to Portugal, where he absolutely did not want to command that army. If you're going to send off somebody to do a military operation, you've got to get somebody who really wants to be there, don't you? I mean, isn't that a classic lesson of history?
We're both, I mean, you more formally than I, interested in Napoleon, but I mean, Villeneuve didn't really believe in what he was doing at Trafalgar, did he?
No, exactly. And there were plenty of people on the Russian campaign that in 1812 that started to think that once you got to Smolensk, that's fine for that campaigning season. You know, you don't need to go on to Moscow. But this is all volume 3, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's. Well, let's not go into volume 3 now. Let's talk about Charlemagne the Magnificent from your book. He really was magnificent.
Who was?
Charlemagne the Magnificent.
Not a great father, I would say.
That's true of a lot of your people.
But you know, again, there's a man. He when he besieged Vienna, he didn't really make a proper job of it. Now, it wouldn't have been easy to take it anyway, but he made a very inadequate attack on Vienna, and was repulsed.
You're one of the great soldiers that does emerge from this book is, of course, Genghis Khan, who you go so far as to equate with Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon as one of the 4 great conquerors, great generals of history. But you then go on to talk about his lieutenant, who I admit I'd never heard of, called Subutai.
He really did most of the fighting, and he was a very clever tactician and strategist.
Tell us the story of the children's toys. I love that one. This is a guy called Subutai. His dates are 1175 to 1248. Tell us the children's story, toys. Trek. Ruse.
Well, he wanted to deceive his opponents into thinking that there was a rout of the Mongols, so he had these children's toys strewn about as if it was the civilian baggage train fleeing eastwards, and so they picked up the pace and charged right into an ambush that he'd laid for them.
Genius, and one of several acts of genius.
He arranged to leave a massive imprints of boots proceeding eastwards, but it was a fraud.
Yeah. Incredibly clever. And also, I tell you what was also incredibly clever from that period is Genghis Khan's method of keeping his burial place secret.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about how he did that?
And all the grave diggers after their exertions were all murdered.
And then the murderers were murdered. That was the other one as well. You know, you can't just stop. You can't just stop after you've killed the grave diggers. It is a bloody story, isn't it? It's on a deeper sort of more serious level. Has human nature changed that much? There's very little peace in this book, which covers 1600 years. You say that education might have made us more thoughtful than in the earlier periods, although I wasn't convinced by that necessarily. Tell us about human nature and how we've changed.
Well, I'm afraid human nature doesn't change much, but we do. One point I would, to be serious here, like to make is I came away from all this. I'm now almost through the 3rd volume. I'm happy to say I'm up into the 9th. I'm up to Mr. Nixon now, so I'm going to finish it. But the progress exists. And when you look at the state of man when I began in the first volume, you know, in ancient Mesopotamia and contemporary events in India and China, really we were just clans whose whole purpose was to find a neighbor sufficiently accessible that was not militarily proficient and kill them all and take their territory and plunder them. And that was what we did. That was the species. and all manner of horrible things have happened up to and including in our own lifetimes, Andrew. But no one can deny that there has been a great deal, objectively, of progress in the way people are organized, the way collective jurisdictions deal with each other, and in the way that extensive attention is effectively paid to raising everyone's standard of living. I mean, India is in some ways a dysfunctional country, and China is a totalitarian country, but they both bring tens of millions of people out of poverty every year. So there is progress, but no, human nature reverts to a pretty primitive condition quite easily. And I guess we're again getting out of the era of the book we're talking about, but no matter how familiar one is with the facts, the indisputable reality that the culture of Goethe and Beethoven did what happened in the Third Reich is just incomprehensible, but it did happen.
And you do argue in this book that democracy, even in modest dosages, is good for fighting mediocrity, incompetence, and corruption, or at least it's better at it than dictatorship is. And I suppose that's a positive aspect to take away from this book, even though obviously there's not much dictatorship in.
Despite my great admiration for Rishi, he, with that marvelous French logic, often attributed to his contemporary and semi-friendly contemporary Descartes, he thought democracy was rubbish. He thought Parliament was a talking shop where all you got were a lot of self-interested groups arguing their own interest and ignoring the interests of the state. And it just wasted a lot of time and energy. And he was absolutely right if you have a genius as a leader like himself. But Augustus was the first example. It's a man who governed either singly or with one other person for 58 years. An astounding achievement, especially at that time. The system worked very well as long as he was running it. But when you got to Caligula and Nero and others, it didn't work so well.
Yes, I like the fact that you put down the fall of Caligula partly to having a tax on prostitution. That's never going to be popular, is it?
He was a lusty young man, but he was not a very benign ruler.
Tell us about Gibbon and you don't go along with Gibbon's view of the role of Christianity in the late Roman Empire, do you?
Well, Gibbon was an atheist. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it colors his views. To him, all religions are superstitious rubbish, and he rather preferred the ancient Roman religion because he liked the multiplicity of saints and so forth. I mean, saint equivalents, gods, I guess, and it didn't seem to occur to him that when you propagated the idea, and I'm not getting into how accurate this is, but when people believed that the son of a single God for everybody did appear on earth and was horribly murdered as a deliberate sacrifice to redeem the human soul, that is a very powerful brand, and it took like wildfire. And by the way, I think Islam is essentially an imitation of it, but except that the prophet didn't want to die like Christ did, so he became a warrior instead of a martyr. But again, I'm not casting aspersions on his sincerity, but there was an element of imitation in it. And of course, they recruited that frequent flyer, the Archangel Gabriel, to come back and confer the revelations on the Islamists as well. But Gibbon's idea was that, as you know, Christianity essentially diluted the self-protective instincts of the Western Roman Empire. And my view is if the Western Roman Empire had converted more quickly, it would have resisted much more strongly. I mean, the barbarians, once they installed themselves in Western Europe, converted much more quickly than the original inhabitants did. They brought in their ludicrously primitive religions from the steppes and said, no, I mean, this is the real thing here. This Christian business is actually quite persuasive. And if we'd had that to fight them with, we would have had a more motivated resistance. As you know, the Romans overcompromised with the early barbarians, and the whole thing just collapsed like France in 1940.
And you also then go on to say that the papacy, quote, always prevails eventually. And that's not necessarily that much to do with the papacy, isn't it? Apart from its longevity, it just sort of out-survives everybody. Isn't
Well,
that
this
the
is right.
case?
I mean, I personally didn't think very much of the late Pope's agreement with the People's Republic of China, but his predecessors did the same with William the Conqueror and Louis the XIV and a lot of other monarchs. And the dynasties go away, but the church endures. I mean, in its way.
You mentioned the Prophet Muhammad. How did he go from coming from a poor family to being essentially the king of Western Arabia so quickly? And you mentioned him as being a leader of armies and not a victim like Jesus. Was that his special power, as it were?
Well, our Islamic friends would suggest that my qualifications to exercise the fact that we're all unlicensed psychiatrists in respect of the prophet were questionable. But I don't want to say anything offensive to Islamists.
Well, you don't in this book. I mean, you have him
great,
as a very successful military commander in this book.
And a very successful religious leader. But he did have an interesting relationship with that woman, the older woman who paid the bills for him. And look, I think that it took fire as both a kind of religious thunderbolt at the same time that it captured and set itself at the head of ethnic discontent. And the Arabs felt that they had been treated as a backwater and just a bunch of idiots going around in bedclothes on camels in the desert. And they really deserved better, and they were going to show people what they were really going to make their point. And they got across North Africa faster than Montgomery or Rommel did. They got from Alexandria to Gibraltar in a very short time, and then of course they encroached upon Europe at both ends, centuries apart. But they were repulsed in France in the 8th century, and then they made their approach in the Balkans and under the Turks. But they besieged the Christian world for a long time.
Let's go on to Oliver Cromwell. You talk about his sincerity and patriotism, but someone who bequeathed little of value. So you don't go along with the Whigs who see him as a sort of proto-democrat.
I think the Whigs are utilitarian myth makers until they became sort of lovable, cynical patricians like the late Lord Carrington, But they. No, I don't agree with the great bad man theory. I mean, I don't think he was bad, but he was so severe and inflexible that he watered down the potential value of his contribution to history. But he was a very capable man. And look, in some ways, he was a proto-democrat. I would agree with that. He was a meritocrat. He brought the Jews back, and they had they were expelled, as under Edward I, I believe. And but here was a man who hated Catholicism so much he would not, when he was deathly ill, and the only cure was quinine, which had been discovered by the Jesuits, he wouldn't take it because it was invented by the Jesuits or discovered. I mean, this is not rational, and. But I would say that he did have some good points, and he did in many ways. I guess it must be said that he ultimately advanced the parliamentary cause. But meanwhile his head was on a pike for 25 years.
Yeah, and he did close down Parliament as well, of course, in 1653.
But still, it's a.
I didn't know, by the way, that he tried to go to Connecticut in 1634. He'd have saved everyone a lot of trouble if he'd done that, wouldn't he? Apart from possibly the people of Connecticut.
I don't know how he would have got on in the New World.
One of his one of the messages that also comes out again and again from this book is always pay your soldiers. Cromwell got that right. He made sure that but so many people didn't, did they?
Oh yeah, yeah. But that was really Marius who started that, and that was we're going back to the first volume, but once, if I may say it, because it does carry on through into this book, once the Senate murdered the Gracchi, and they were kind of the Roosevelts and the Kennedys of the time, they were grandsons of Scipio and so on. Well, once they murdered them and said, the hell with you, we're not having reform, we're the Senate, we'll do what we want, and then squandered the Roman army in northern Italy. After that, you had this succession of very talented generals, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, where the loyalty of they won their battles, they were great generals, but the loyalty of the soldiers was to them and not the system. So they governed, and the whole official structure broke down. But and you had that repeatedly when the conqueror becomes the hero and the loyalty is to him, because that's frankly where the money is, and he's the most galvanizing figure. But Cromwell had more integrity than some of his forebears in that regard. I mean, I think Cromwell was in his way an honest man. He was just a fanatic.
Best king of France in this volume, Henry IV or Louis XIV?
Henry IV.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, Paris is worth a mass is better than I am the state.
It's one of the great quotes of it.
I still think the greatest was Napoleon's from the sublime to the ridiculous is a single step. It's the ultimate French statement.
Absolutely. Well, I do hope it's going to be in volume 3. And tell us more about Henry IV. Apart from his change of religion in order to become king, what else did he leave France?
Well, the two sides to that coin. I mean, obviously it was in some respects a cynical move, but the St. Bartholomew's Massacre and things like that. France was on the verge of really terrible religious strife, and he did avoid that. Well,
he was protected on that day by Catherine de' Medici, wasn't he? He could have been killed that day had she not made sure.
Poor old Sully, who was a distinguished Protestant prime minister for him, only escaped by gathering a Catholic breviary and marching, piously around Paris with this Catholic liturgy in his hand. But he expanded France and consolidated it, I think everything was set up for Louis by Richelieu and Mazarin, and there were just too many wars, and he didn't do that well in the wars. He had no concept of developing an alliance, so the odds were that you would win. I mean, France performed historically with great distinction, given that, for example, in the War of the Spanish Succession, it was really fighting a whole bunch of countries at the same time, and it didn't lose, but it didn't win, and the casualties were heavy and the costs were heavy. So I mean, I don't think he was strategically a good king, but Henry IV was. He got France to the edge of being the greatest power in Europe. Now, the regency that followed him and the prime ministers who served Louis XIII and Louis XIV when he was a very young man, really, really did it for them. But it was more or less. I know there was an interruption of 8 years, but that Henry IV started it, and Richelieu and Mazarin carried it forward.
You mentioned Henry VIII earlier, somebody who essentially created his own religion. not as great as his daughter, we both agree, who you say, quote, more than anyone else set Britain on the course of exercising the influence that it has had on the modern world. But what else? What else can you say in favour of Henry VIII? Because friends of ours like Paul Johnson have equated him to Stalin. That's not fair, is it?
Well, no, I mean, but we loved Paul, but he had some fairly esoteric ideas. Look, it must be said, and here I do volunteer that my particular focus on him in preparing this book raised my respect for him as a ruler. I think it's easy to, and natural, I guess, to attach too much importance to his indifferent performance as a husband. But
that's a great way of putting it. Indifferent performance as a husband. All right, I'll let you get that. Okay, have that one.
I have always found the idea of Henry VIII as a religious leader utter nonsense. And as you know, the title Defender of the Faith was given to him because of a paper Erasmus wrote and was awarded by the Pope. And he told Parliament when he apostatized that he wanted the title reconfirmed for him as head of his new church, you see. And essentially, in religious terms, it's fraud, but it's been quite a distinguished church all the same. And but he did spare Britain a lot of religious strife that was extremely damaging, for example, in Germany. And he did really found the Royal Navy. And while he fell out with Wolsey, and I think bad things would have happened to Wolsey if he hadn't died of natural causes first, that's where they really got going on operating the balance of power in Europe. And he completely outmaneuvered Francis I. Now, Francis I was not that astute. He was energetic, but not that astute. And ultimately, I would say that he outmaneuvered Charles V, which was not an easy thing to do. So I think Henry VIII was, one, a clever statesman. Two, he did organize Europe. I mean, leaving out whatever one's views of the relative merits of the Anglicans and the non-Episcopal Protestants and the Catholics may be, he did get Britain through that period relatively bloodlessly, and he was a personality that attracted the imagination of the country liked him, rather like Charles II. They had a sort of laddish liking of him. They thought he was a bit of a scoundrel, but kind of a charming chap. And I sort of assumed that he was regarded as a more bloodstained figure, but I don't think he was. I think that people liked him. So I think he was actually quite a capable monarch, although he did some things that you really can't approve of.
No, and he wouldn't want to be married to him.
And the quality of his chancellors went down. I mean, Wolsey was a great man. More was a great man. Cromwell was Thomas Cromwell obviously was a competent, but less stature. And Richard Rich was just a placeman.
Let's move on to Charlemagne. I know that it doesn't. None of this is chronologically makes any sense at all. But what's your view of him?
Extremely capable man, but wasn't able to do anything durable. I mean, the Carolingian Empire came apart at the seams within a few years of his dying. He didn't. I mean, Augustus left enough to be restored. I mean, first of all, you had that splendid second century with the 5 good emperors from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, and then it really fell apart. But Diocletian and Constantine and others could put it back together, and even Theodosius at the end. But Charlemagne, it all just went to pieces, and nothing remained of it. And the relic of the Holy Roman Empire was, of course, it's a notoriously absurd title. All 3 words of the title are inapplicable. But Uh, he was one of these people who dominated his times, but didn't have the gift of creating durable institutions.
What do you think of the Marxist critique of the great men and women of his theory of history? That actually none of these people we've mentioned at all really matter, because what really matters are the vast impersonal forces of, I don't know, the printing press or industrialization or disease or so on. And that actually this kind of history that you've written, which is very much a great man and woman view of history, is sort of intellectually bereft. That's what the Marxists would say of your book, wouldn't they? What do you make of that?
It's not just great men; it's bad men, but it's men. I mean, the people make
great meaning, important and charismatic and so on, but not nice. There are very few nice people in this book.
Saint Boniface and Saint Francis. Look, to be fair to that view, obviously, we would be intellectual Luddites if we said things like the printing press and the Industrial Revolution were completely incidental, and all that mattered was, people like the ones we've mentioned, but in the end, people make history, and they are responsible for the Industrial Revolution. People like I.K. Brunel and so on, and they're responsible for the introduction of it and the administration of it. And so I think you have to allow for these trends. So we have to give the Marxists and others that, certainly, and we can't just put our heads in the sand and say that it didn't matter. But on the other hand, their theory, which they of course completely throw into the closet and slam and lock the door behind it, when they're considering people like Lenin or Mao Zedong or something, who all of a sudden emerge and are great helmsmen and inspired rulers and fathers of the world and everything. So they're total hypocrites and that sort of thing. You said we have to have a bit of both. People make history, people write history, people read history, but there are trends, but who makes the trends and who administers them? Obviously, people do.
And also, you're writing a political and strategic history of the world. You're not writing an economic and social history of the world.
This is it. I mean, you have to refer to it. But if I was trying to write a real history of the world, you couldn't. You really would need a lot of volumes to do that. And that's why, the comprehensive Cambridge history from earliest times to modern times is 40 volumes, all taken all together.
Yeah, it's a wonderful work of history, isn't it? I think I can see it behind you, can't I?
I got it all back. I read it all.
Yeah,
it takes a long time to read it.
Yeah. Why was the Peace of Westphalia such a watershed? Did it really inaugurate a new era of nation states?
I think it's been exaggerated in the last few years, but yes, what I say, I always felt that the greatest significance of it was essentially there were two things. One was the national interest became a far more, transcendently more important criterion for policymaking than sectarian matters. I mean, Richelieu essentially underwrote the King of Sweden, quite a strenuous Protestant, marching all around Germany, wreaking havoc, and Richelieu was happy with this. And the fact that his chief opponents were Richelieu's own co-religionists were a matter that Richelieu himself was not, he didn't care about that. And secondly, as you know, from the beginnings, the earliest glimmerings of organizing Europe on the basis of national states, essentially coextensive with the language, so that the Spanish spoke Spanish and the Dutch spoke Dutch and so forth. Everyone realized from Richelieu up to Napoleon that you had to divide Germany or it would dominate Europe. And Richelieu was an overachiever. He divided, even though he died 6 years before the Treaty of Westphalia, he essentially left the major elements to Mazarin to put in the treaties. But they divided Germany into over 300 principalities and jurisdictions, and it took more than 200 years for Bismarck to put it all back together. And so that enabled France to be essentially the leading country on the continent of Europe up until the end of Napoleon's time.
We're looking forward to volume 3. You, all the way through this book, give little hints, I think, about volume 3, which is great to read. My favourite one is where you equate Caligula and Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Kaiser Wilhelm's personal life was less open to criticism, but his judgment wasn't much better.
Yeah. But you also say that there's something about the concept of the improvement of man's condition, which is going to be more important in volume 3, or at least the idea that you can improve man's condition is more sort of prevalent in the mindsets of politicians in volume 3, I think, than in earlier periods. Is that fair?
Yes, and it is, and I believe that I think it's demonstrably accurate too. And we saw that in the Cold War, which was really ultimately, I mean, you had a state of reciprocal military deterrence, so the superpowers never fired a shot at each other. And I mean, they fired a few shots at others, but not at each other. And it became a competition of which system works better. And in the end, as we saw, the communist system simply fell like a souffle. But so we now have the Chinese calling themselves communists, but it's only a half a command economy. It's largely a market economy.
What history book or biography are you reading at the moment, Conrad?
Well, because of these tumultuous events in the Middle East, I found myself reading Primo Levi's "Is This a Man?" And it's a very moving account of his time at Auschwitz. And I just, filed a column. I write in Europe and the United States and Canada, and I changed the wording around. I don't inflict exactly the same wording on everybody, but I've just made the point that this is the first test since the end of World War II of the determination of the Jewish people in carrying out their promise, which is far more than a slogan, never again. I mean, Iran has declared itself under the Islamic Republic to be mortal enemy of Israel. In the wars that Israel fought with the Arab powers, they did not want a Jewish state, but they weren't claiming the right or ambition to kill all the Jews. I mean, in fairness, the king of Jordan, Hussein, and the President Sadat of Egypt were civilized men, and they ultimately composed their differences with Israel. But this is a regime that quite frequently and with no subtlety at all declares its goal and chief mission to be to destroy the Jews, at least in the Middle East. And I find that, I must say, I mean, as you, I note that you mentioned General Sherman's famous statement, "The war is hell," and your comment on the House of Lords about the relatively low number of civilian dead in the counter-urban guerrilla war going on in Gaza. I find it, being understood that war is a terrible thing. And as Sherman said, the only people who don't know that it's hell are the people who've never seen it. And it sure was hell the way he conducted it, burning Atlanta to the ground and so on. But I find it edifying to see Israel with 1/12 of the population of Iran and less than 1/50th of the territory hammering the hell out of these, and not the people of Iran, but that ghastly Islamic regime, the pseudo-theocracy. And I also find, and this has nothing to do with what you asked me, but or not much to do with it, but I also find the rather masterly performance of the U.S. president, who is at times, though I'm a supporter of him and has been a friend of mine for 25 years, but he sometimes, could stand a brief session in charm school, but I mean, as a public figure. But I find the fact that he is sticking with the Israelis to be very distinguished conduct by the world's most powerful country.
And what's your what if, your counterfactual history moment?
You mean ever?
Actually, it would be best, of course, if you had one that was in the this volume too, the period between the Caesars to Louis XIV.
Well, the most horrifying one is if domestic affairs didn't cause the Mongol invasion of Europe to stop. I mean, all of a sudden they just
How far west do you think they'd have got to Paris?
I have to say, I don't know who was going to stop them. I mean, that was one hell of an army. And the signaling, they started this business with a semaphore so they could signal across a front of 1,000 miles in a couple of hours. I mean, no one ever thought of that before. This is a phenomenon you would have noticed too. You get these freakish victories of little peoples because they're so militarily proficient. The first time I saw that was the Hyksos taking over all Egypt because they had these war chariots with the blades on the wheels, so the Egyptians didn't know how to deal with it. It was like the Panzers in France in 1940. But I don't know who was going to stop the Mongols. But they were great conquerors, but they weren't great rulers. I mean, that whole thing vanished like Tamerlane. There was nothing left of it 50 years after the great Khan died.
I think it's a great one. And I don't think that if they had conquered the whole of Western Europe, that we would now be arguing that progress exists, or at least that's what you argue in your...
Well, I think we'd have to say it stopped for a while anyway. The skyscrapers would be made of human skulls.
Conrad Black, author of The Political and Strategic History of the World, Volume 2. Thank you very much indeed for appearing on Secrets of Statecraft.
Oh, thank you for having me, Andrew. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Conrad. On my next Secrets of Statecraft, my guest will be the historian and one of the world's foremost experts on China, Frank Dakota.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.